plot is no more than footprints left in the snow after your characters have run by on their way to incredible destinations. Ray Bradbury. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. Fiction would be nothing without characters. Consider the question, does plot propel characters, or do characters propel the plot? I'd argue it's the latter, and the way I interpret that Ray Bradbury quote from the top is that good plot is the result of good characterization, basically a side effect. Plot is no more than footprints left in the snow after your characters have run by on their way to incredible destinations. I love that. Host of My Life in Books, Red Szell, is here again, joining us from London, UK. Red, we're talking characters today, but specifically memorable characters that really stick with us. How's it going, man?
Really well, thanks, Jacob. I think that's a beautiful quote from Ray Bradbury. I'd never heard that before. And yeah, it really sums up what I love so much about books. And I couldn't agree with you more. It's, for me, the best books are character-driven. And you come away feeling like you've spent time with a new person. Whether you like that new person or not depends on what kind of character they were and their actions. But I think especially with audiobooks nowadays, actually character is so important because you need a sense of the voice of the people that you're dealing with.
Huh. I never thought of it having a particular advantage in audiobooks because when you have a good narrator behind it, they can add more characterization than just the page. Now, you could argue that in print, the reader can do that themselves, but narrators are excellent actors, almost always. And so characters really come to life in audiobooks.
Well, it's funny, and when I was a kid, I used to read my books out loud to myself and sort of play the different characters as if it was like a theatre. It probably says an awful lot about my character. And my mum used to say, oh, that's a lovely way of reading books because you're really bringing them to life. And I suppose that's maybe why I love audiobooks so much, because ideally your narrator is providing theatre for one. They are the whole cast and the director. And I think especially with some of the really, truly great narrators that we have now, their versatility allows them to bring even the minor characters to life. Sometimes those minor characters are actually pretty memorable themselves.
There are no good books without good characters. And you mentioned it earlier that characters drive the plot almost always, but you could argue that all books are character driven, right? Like, how does a book work if it's not character driven? I'd argue that it's just some books are to lesser extent or to a higher extent driven by characters. Because if it's not character driven at all, it's basically just bullet points of a story. What's the point of actually writing the story if you're not like writing almost always informs the characters more than anything else.
It's funny, actually. Yeah, I was just quickly thinking, all books, is it just fiction? But actually looking even at non-fiction, the best history books tend to concentrate on the characters who were making history, the kings, the queens, the generals, the anarchists, and so on and so forth. And actually, even books about geography, it's almost always about the human interaction with the geography around them that makes those books, that gives them interest to us as readers. I suppose we're always looking for something we can empathize with or latch onto in a book. And so, yes, we automatically go for the character. Either you love them or you hate them. And I do think there are some genres that really lend themselves to strong and memorable characters. And of course, you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to come back to my first great love, detective fiction, which I think has some of the most memorable characters in literature across the board.
Is that one of those genres you feel is specifically well suited for good characters? Because that's not the first genre that would come to mind. What is it about detective fiction that does it for you when it comes to characters?
I think whether it's police procedural or private investigator, you have to have a strong lead investigating the crime, because they are helping you as the reader to solve the puzzle. And, you can just reel off the names from Sherlock Holmes to Agatha Christie's Poirot or Miss Marple, Jack Reacher, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, The Continental Op by Dashiell Hammett. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Michael Connelly's Hieronymus Bosch. They're all really strong, often quite quirky characters, which I think is interesting. But they're synonymous with detection.
Detection and just being extremely perceptive like Sherlock Holmes, right? Looking at it more broadly, I always found that longer books in series have an advantage in character development just because there's more page count. And so it's so difficult to develop a really compelling character in a short book. And I think that's partly why I personally enjoy fantasy, because those books tend to be a little longer. They take their time with things, and therefore characters are more interesting, more fleshed out. Do you think there's something to that longer books almost definitely have an advantage in developing good characters?
Yeah, without getting too literary with you, I do remember going to a lecture when I was at university and being told that Emma by Jane Austen was the first great novel in the English language, specifically because the heroine, Emma, develops as a character. She changes in character, and that adds a psychological dimension to the novel. And guess what? It's the longest of Jane Austen's books. And I think you're precisely right there, because Austen needed more space in which to develop, flesh out, and maybe actually experiment with that character as well. And I think a truly memorable character doesn't just get things right. They show the human flaws that we ourselves have and allow us to empathize with them more.
I'm thinking about some shorter books that do have compelling characters, but it's not because they grow. It's because they were kind of presented a window into a person at a point in time that makes you ask questions. Characters in these books that are interesting but don't have that much time to spend time with, they tend to be enigmatic and leave us with a lot of questions. Case in point is Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye. Relatively short book by J.D. Salinger, but Holden Caulfield is a fascinating character that I think a lot of people can relate with. That early adulthood cynicism, that teenage fear of adulthood, and it leaves people afraid and bewildered and cynical of the world. And Holden Caulfield famously doesn't grow at all, and that's why people are infuriated by that book.
Yeah,
but still, very popular, very successful book with a character that does not develop whatsoever.
And a short book as well, crucially.
Yes.
I think that's right. There would have been no room. There would have been nothing much to put in add to any additional pages if Salinger had just stuck with him as he was. So, and perhaps it's why he didn't appear in any more books. But yes, I take your point.
I don't think I'd want to spend more time with Holden Caulfield than I did in that book anyways.
Yeah, but what would a 50-year-old Holden Caulfield look like?
Oh my God, I wouldn't want to know.
No.
But that kind of brings up the question that just because it's a small book, and just because there was no character development doesn't mean that they were a bad character. But what more broadly makes a bad character? Like, what is it that leaves a character unmemorable and forgettable?
I think two-dimensional writing, actually. Flat dialogue. I take a lot of my interpretation of a character from what they say. I love good dialogue. I love good snappy dialogue, and that gives you a 3D sense of a character. If I think the author is just describing John Smith walked down the street wearing a grey suit and a grey hat. It was a grey day, and he was thinking about his boring job. Then you get really no sense of, any form of interest to his character. It's actually often only when the character opens their mouth, as happens in human beings in our interaction every day, that you get a real sense of what's going on underneath the hood. And so, yeah, I think poor characterization tends to go with poor writing. And part of poor writing, I think, is not writing great dialogue.
And I'll add to that bland characters that kind of fall into archetypes can be very frustrating because it feels like I've already seen this character before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has to be said, the James Bond books, with the exception of James Bond, the villain, and very few of the female characters who actually stand up to Bond at all. Everybody else is just cardboard cutouts. Now, okay, that can throw relief on the great character of James Bond, the archetypal, ruthless assassin and lover. But, really, I think we'll probably struggle to name more than 5 other characters in James Bond books.
And James Bond is a good example of one of those characters that the reader is kind of meant to put themselves in their shoes. Like, I think it would be cool to be James Bond, but I would be very dishonest if I said that I found him relatable. If you find James Bond relatable, then you are living an unbelievable life.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably know to go and see some help. But it's funny, isn't it? The flip side of this would be George Smiley in the John le Carré novels, who a lot of people would turn around and say, oh, God, those books are so long and he is so painstaking. But that is precisely George Smiley's modus operandum. He is a slow, painstaking civil servant, a little bit of a little grey man, but no less memorable for it, because he is the ultimate adversary to spies who wish to undermine the British Secret Service or to commit acts of terror. And he is needed to bring them down, and therefore he really sticks in the memory.
Wait, what series is this from?
John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy type of books. He's the he's the quiet, methodical spy, the kind of the antithesis of James Bond and all the super spies with guns. In fact, I'm trying to remember whether le Carré, whether George Smiley ever picks up a gun. I wouldn't be so sure he does.
Okay, that kind of brings me to something I want to talk about, and it has to do with character dynamics, because good characters almost never exist in a vacuum. Their characterization is heavily informed by other characters, their relationships with other characters. And the main example I can think of right now is Frodo Baggins and Gollum from the Lord of the Rings series. That one's very on the nose, but both those characters are not nearly as compelling if one of them was extracted. Gollum is basically a representation of what Frodo might become, what he can be if he lets the ring take him over. And it's in reverse too. Gollum sees Frodo as like what Gollum used to be before the ring kind of turned him into Gollum. It's a fascinating dynamic, but it explains so much of that dynamic explains so much of why Frodo empathizes with Gollum, who's a character that by all means should not really receive any empathy considering what he's done. He's quite a questionable character, but there's so many dynamics like these that I find fascinating. Can you think of any others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of detective, I'm sorry to come back to my favourite hobby horse again, but there are lots of detective duos that you get, such as, Inspector Morse and his sidekick Lewis. You have
or Sherlock Holmes and Watson.
Sherlock Holmes and Watson, indeed. And even Lord Peter Wimsey and his long-suffering butler who I nearly called Bunter. Yes, it is Bunter. Sorry, I'm getting confused.
Bunter the butler.
Bunter the butler, indeed. But yeah, again, and actually, you've got the P.G. Wodehouse books as well, Jeeves and Wooster. The sensible butler who actually is the hero of all those pieces, and the hooray Henry of Bertie Wooster, whose life is just so chaotic. He'd be a total dead loss without his faithful sidekick. And yes, it's chalk and cheese. It's black and white. It's wonderful contrast.
Chalk and cheese? I've never heard that before. But no, characters do not exist in a vacuum because they need to interact with each other. And they can't just bounce into each other like two marbles. Like they kind of like meld together. The dynamic itself is a character in a way. And something else I'll throw in there for what makes characters memorable is specificities. Things that make them distinctive from the thousands of characters that we've read before. Now, you don't need to have something that's like unbelievably out of the box, but even very simple things. Like how Detective Poirot from Agatha Christie books loves to manicure his mustache. That's a very distinctive trait that for some reason always sticks to me.
Exactly, and Miss Marple has her knitting, yes. It's funny. I was thinking of Harry Potter here as well, and in some ways, I think Harry Potter is the least memorable of the characters in those books. We think of him with his broken glasses and his scar, and the boy wizard who is trying to not be killed by his destiny. And yet, it's Snape and Dumbledore and the Weasleys and Hermione and a whole cast of other characters, Professor Sprout, who you actually immediately, they're the 3D vibrant characters who really are, you come away with thinking, oh my goodness, I'll go to my grave remembering those characters. Harry Potter's a little, and I think purposefully so, a little bit of a reflecting mirror to that ensemble of characters around him.
A bit of a James Bond type character. You're meant to put yourself in his shoes, have that magical experience of going to this like amazing magic school in a beautiful castle out in the Scottish countryland. But it's true. Ron, he's this like super loyal friend that comes from this very interesting family with a lot of like history behind it. Super loyal, kind of a funny guy, a bit of a buffoon, like comedic relief. And then there's Hermione, who's very intelligent. She's half-blood, meaning she always has to deal with these challenges on her identity. And then there's Harry Potter, who there's just not much to say about him, is there?
Broken glasses and scar. Yeah, it's kind of like the Harold Lloyd of the book. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How sometimes the incidental characters really step out of the shadows and overshadow the protagonist. You have Willy Wonka, for instance. It's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. No, Willy Wonka is the guy we all remember. And Miss Danvers in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. In fact, Rebecca as well, and she doesn't make an appearance, but she is there in the background all the time. And Miss Danvers is this woman in black lurking in the shadows, and sort of really is the character we come away thinking of most. And I think that the one that always amuses me is Frankenstein's monster. We all think of Frankenstein. We can all picture him. And actually in the MGM movies, Universal movies, it led to people turning around and sort of saying, oh, Frankenstein is the monster. And, so you have people
which is
dressing
so
up.
not the point of the story.
I know, absolutely. But I'm dressing up as Frankenstein. What, as a German doctor? No, I'm dressing up as a zombie. It's like, no, that's Frankenstein's monster. And yet, he's so big in people's imagination that he's assumed the title of the book.
Yeah, that's people not reading the book correctly. Although you could argue that whatever way you interpret the book is the correct way to interpret it. Right, like the book is what you make of it, essentially. But it's a good example with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. To bring it back to Harry Potter, a character that does have a lot of layers and is pretty controversial is Snape. He's cold and cruel at times, but I think he's a good character example to explain the theory of the wound and the mask. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, yeah.
So for the people who don't know, the wound and the mask theory of characterization is that compelling characters, often has an emotional wound from their past, like grief or shame or betrayal or something like that, and that they develop a mask to cope with it. Sarcasm, perfectionism, or heroism. Snape from Harry Potter, his wound is betrayal by friends, unrequited love from Lily Potter, and guilt over her eventual death. His mask to deal with that grief and those complex feelings is to be cold and cruel.
Yeah.
And it explains the way he is. And this theory, when it's applied well in characterization, adds one of the key ingredients in the stew that is good characterization, and that's proper motivation that makes sense, and understand why characters do the things that they do. There should be a logical reason behind it, because it's great for characters to be fun and distinctive. They need to be understandable. Readers don't want characters to be enigmatic. It's not interesting. You need to get that payoff of understanding why people are the way they are. It's like in real life, Red. I want to know why people are the way they are. That's one of the beautiful things about books, because we get those answers.
Exactly. A good backstory is vital, I think, to any character, or the development of any character through a series. And I think, that's why quite often I like, books 3, 4, 5 in a series, because by that 100%. Stage, Jack Reacher's a good example. Yeah, we get a sense in The Killing Floor as to what has formed his character. But the more we go through that series, the more we understand why he is unable to form attachments, why he is the kind of man that he is. He's damaged goods, but he's damaged in a way that can prevent the same ills being done to other people. He is there, out there for the underdog. He does not want anybody else to get trampled underfoot.
Now, to be clear, not every character wears a mask, but it can the wound and the mask theory, or this application, if you were to use it for your characters, it's a good way of understanding character motivations. Like, another way to look at it is that the mask or the wound is the motivation, and the mask is the way it's applied. Like, for example, Tyrion from the A Song of Ice and Fire series, his mask is that he's incredibly witty and intelligent, and he uses it to protect himself in conversations by keeping people on their feet and insulting them in really clever ways. He does that because he's been rejected his entire life by his family. And so this is his way of dealing with it, to divert the conversation away from that rejection. Another example is Edmond Dantes from The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, one of my favorite books. His wound is bitter resentment over betrayal, and in dealing with that, his mask is becoming, and it's pretty on the nose in this one too, he quite literally uses disguises, is he becomes this enigmatic, incredibly wealthy and powerful count, this aristocrat with a god complex. And it's all show. It's a mask in reaction to a wound, and the truth is, a lot of real people act this way. That's the truth.
Yeah, and I guess it's a spin-off from that old and very little mourned trait of the 18th, 19th and early 20th century, well, actually, even through into this century, where you would have your villain disfigured or disabled in some way. It's all we have to do is think of the Batman villains. But there's always some actual physical scarring there. I think, Dennis Wheatley was awful at doing this. He might have written great thumping plots, but, read a book like Ride with the Devil, and every single one of the 9 villains, I think it is, has a disability of some sort. So there's a blind person, and he's very happy to use words that nowadays we wouldn't even entertain. And yes, I suppose maybe the scars are psychological in the 21st century, but certainly in the past, they were, physically disfiguring.
I made a list of a few of my favorite characters from books, and you making that comment made me a little self-conscious, right? Because 3 of them have disabilities, and they're all very bad people. I kind of like villains. They often tend to be the most interesting psychologically. Can I tell you about a few of them?
Yeah.
One of my favorite was from Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. He's one of the most well-known writers of grimdark fantasy nowadays. He has a very memorable character called Friendly. Friendly is a big thug for hire who has OCD and is clearly on the spectrum somewhere. He has no qualms with violence, and he has a long history of crime. And his story finishes by realizing that the best place for him to be is in prison, because he loves counting and he loves discipline, and he can count the number of bars on his cell. And then at the end, when he goes to submit himself to prison because he realizes the best place for him to be, because of all the chaos he and his crew have caused throughout the story, they couldn't afford to pay the guards, and so therefore he can't stay in prison anymore. No. It's kind of tragic. So his punishment in the end for being a thug is not being able to go to prison.
You gotta love a book with a sense of humor.
Yeah, it's like there's a lot of dark humor in that book, but I know that some people might find this application of the psychology around disability in characterization a bit uncomfortable. Personally, I think it's fair game. People have disabilities. I think it's well worth exploring respectfully, and I actually think that the way it's done in Game of Thrones with Tyrion and him is done very well.
Well, maybe that's a subject for future discussion. Heroes with disabilities rather than villains.
Okay, that's a good one. I think we picked our next topic. That was easy. We usually have an hour-long conversation trying to figure it out.
Excellent. We'll have to start our homework soon.
Yeah, we will. I'll start it right now. Red, thank you so much for your time. We could have kept going for this. We'll talk again to you in 2 weeks.
Very much look forward to it, Jacob. Thanks for having me again.
For sure. Always. That was Red Szell. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. It's also available as a podcast. And that's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can email us your feedback at audiobookrareview@ami.ca. The email is audiobookrareview@ami.ca. You can also follow us on Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. The handle is at AMI Audiobook Review. It's not just for plugging the next episode. We're posting reels of our best moments on the show and exclusive content as well once in a while. I'm Jacob Shymanski. Thanks for listening.